Hello, welcome back to World War II TV and a strange deja vu experience. It feels like we've all done this before, but that's because we have done part one an hour ago and now we're doing part two. So in the first show, Ted Hibbard took us through the origins of the 45th Division, the National Guard, the federalization. We talked a little bit about them in the Great War, the interwar period, and we took us up to the completion of Operation Husky, the liberation of Sicily. And now Ted is back to talk about Italy. And in this show, another thing we'll be doing again is sort of diving into some of Ted's personal stories of the numerous veterans he met over the years. So, hello again, Ted. It seems not long since we spoke last.
I know, how quickly it goes.
So, well, we'll bring up the PowerPoint and we'll just kick off where we got to. So, to recap, folks, if you end up finding this show first and haven't found the first show, as I said there in the introduction there, by the time the Italian campaign starts, so the actual mainland Italy, there are no kind of green troops again. Everybody has kind of done it before in some shape or form, and so we'll pick up the story there. I'm going to hand over to Ted. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We the division, as you talked about, got valuable experience while they were in Sicily. They learned what they were up against, to be truthful. And there's nothing like you can train and train and train until you're in actual combat. I think it's a whole other story, but they did very well. And as I said before, they did a very good job showing how well they were in combat. Of course, Operation Avalanche was the invasion of mainland Italy. The Germans, we go back to Sicily a little bit, were able to escape across Messina Straits and get back to Italy. And that was an opportunity missed to take a lot of their troops out of the action. But it is what happens, and that's part of the war. And then you just go on from there. So afterwards, the division, we talked about, somebody asked about regrouping, getting new people into your outfit. Division, of course, lost men from injuries and death. And so they basically were there and regrouping, refitting, and rearming, because they were picked to be the floating reserve for Operation Avalanche. It was to be, I believe, two of the British. I got to look at my notes again. My apologies if that gets bothersome, but the British were going to be to the north to the landing. Now, I kind of set it up. I believe it was the British 10th Corps was in the north. Anyway, the whole idea was to get in to Italy, knock Italy out of the war, move up the boot, take care of the Germans, and secure Rome. Because remember, they were an Axis country, and they wanted to knock them out of the war. And so the British were to land to the north in Sicily, and then the 36th Division was to land at the southern part, and then 45th was to be floating reserve. Now, kind of set it up, the problem they had with Avalanche, and I think this is fairly well known about all the Italian campaign. We were looking at the invasion of North, which would eventually be Normandy and Northern Europe, to try to strike a pretty quick blow against the Germans, try to push their way into Berlin and everything. So we knew the main thrust would eventually be in northern France. But they were preparing for all of the invasion up there. So we had a problem with shipping down in the Mediterranean theater. They were low on transports, and so they knew they were going to end up shuffling troops in from Sicily and everywhere else into the Salerno beachhead. Go to my next slide. Here we go. I'm a little behind on my presentation, so my apologies. They want to keep the pressure on the German troops by striking while the iron's hot. And so just try to knock Italy out of the war and push the Germans back. As Winston Churchill said, let's strike the soft underbelly of Europe. Now, the commander of the United States forces for the Fifth Army was Mark Clark. And Mark Clark, really, I think one of the problems he had was he was not thrilled with the Italian campaign. He wanted to strike in Northern Europe. I think kind of like the North African campaign, this would be something that we could hash out, and we would learn a lot more because, of course, we know North Africa, the United States, we did pretty poor leadership. So we got rid of a lot of poor leaders, and as we did with Sicily, we learned a lot more from that as we advanced on onto Italy. Let's go to my next. The setup we have here is you look at Salerno down in Naples, and you look at the defensive lines that the Germans had set up across the boot of Italy, knowing what they were going to be facing. It was one hill after another. My father was in Korea, and he said, "You top one hill, there's another hill. You top one mountain, there's another mountain." And that was the same situation they had in Italy. So it was going to be move up the boot. It was going to be slow. And again, Mark Clark was not really thrilled with any of that kind of combat. Background and planning. After defeating North Africa, we looked to make next move in the war. Shipping lanes in the Mediterranean have been closed since 41, making it difficult to resupply Allied forces in the Middle East, Far East, and get goods to Russia. So we wanted to pretty much clear the Mediterranean of the Axis powers. And of course, a lot of people don't know that the Italians had a pretty good sized navy. They did control, I believe Mussolini was very proud of his navy and liked controlling their own waters. So it was a pretty difficult time then. Support for the war was waning with the Italians. They really were not sold a great deal. It was fine when they were beating up small countries and taking North Africa, some of the Ethiopians and things like that. But people were really getting tired of it, so they weren't really sold on it. So that made them a strong candidate for the invasion and its location, and it was just not popular. And so the setup before the guys were invading, they had gotten onto their ships and they were coming over. And I remember one of my guys, Bill Willett, was telling us they were elated when they were going over because they heard that Italy had left the war, and they thought, "Oh, here we go. This is going to be a cakewalk. We're just going to walk in there. They're going to, throw wine and champagne at us, and flowers are going to be so happy to see us." So it was kind of a sad situation that they weren't ready for. Next one. Here was the preparations in Palermo. Again, they had the 45th had refitted, and then they were combat loading. These are some great pictures. These are actual photographs of the 45th Division loading up for the invasion. And so here we go, D-Day. And I like to tell people there were several D-Days, and we had ours in Salerno at September 9th, 1943. This is another, I don't know, historians will fight over it. Should there have been preparatory shelling by the Navy? Should we have had bombing missions and things like that? They wanted to achieve an element of surprise, which, as we know, was not achieved. And Germans were waiting as the first wave of landing crafts approached the shore. Again, the Germans figured that the Italians were gonna ditch them. They had an idea that they were going to quit, so they had prepared and they took over positions. They took the Italians out, took their weaponry and everything as such, and they pretty much knew. I've told people, why did we pick Sicily? Why did we pick Salerno? Why did we pick this beach? Why did we go there? Because if you look at the rocky coast of Italy, there's not a whole lot of different places to go in, and so the Germans were able to cover them, especially in the southern part in Salerno. And so artillery, machine gun, and if were set up where they needed, up in the hills were a lot of artillery. And if you look at, if you go to Google, I like to say that the maps, you can see just how flat it is out here. It's about like western Oklahoma. There's not a lot of high terrain and things like that. So it's a very, very flat region.
And I think it's worth just mentioning quickly, Ted, that it's come up on this, that the Germans don't know how to defend Italy because they don't quite know what, as you said, what the Italians are going to do. They don't know how to defend it as a geographical feature. The Allies don't really know how to attack it. When we compare what was happening in Normandy a year later, which is 2 years pretty much of solid planning, and the Germans have spent 2 years planning to defend it. As you said yourself, the Sicily campaign has only ended literally weeks before this. So to kind of put together a plan, I know they'd had some ideas about how they were going to do it before then, but it's compared to the other D-Days, Salerno is an odd one. The recurring theme in this series has been kind of maybe a 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach. The Allies have learned lessons through North Africa, through Torch, through Husky, and some of those lessons they take into it, and some of them they can kind of seem to go back on as well, which makes it a bit odd, I think.
It did. As you said, by this time they were already planning Overlord, the planning stages, and that's a long time to plan that, and it needed a great deal. This was kind of thrown together pretty quick. I think it was part of the, we missed them at Messina, and so what do? Let's hop on as quick as we can kind of a situation. And yeah, you're 100% correct with that. Salerno was, I guess, just a natural landing site, and the Germans had taken the hills up above, and I think Kesselring, who was in charge of command really of Italy, his thing was, well, let's not get him on the beach. Unlike Rommel, let's let him get inland, and then we'll take him out, trap him in there, and hold him. And I think his tactics, well, that's again for historians to fight, which was better or not. But the plan was thrown together pretty quick, and you can kind of see from the map I have here how they were pulled from all over the place, from Sicily, from North Africa to the landings, and the British played a large role in it as well. Especially, I think, of Operation Baytown, just basically hopping the Straits of Messina, and off they go up there. And the Germans were pretty lax down there, but they made up for it. They were able to jump in there and hold them up. These are some more invasion photographs. And let me set this up. I can go back a little bit. Again, with the shipping, it was going to be like a taxi ride. You couldn't get all 3 divisions at the same time. 45th was to be floating reserve. The 10th, I'm sorry about that. The 10th British Corps, and I've got who the outfits were with them. They came in to the north, but they could only bring the 3 divisions at one time, and they brought them piecemeal because we didn't have the shipping, and so that kind of played into the hands of trouble right there. You like to get as many people as you can on at one time and just overwhelm them. The British, we had the Americans, we had Rangers up north of the British. I believe it was the 46th. I'm looking here, in the 56th British divisions.
That's it.
And then the 36th was to land down in the south, closer to Salerno. And this is kind of the picture of the original beachhead when they did get on. The 36th, I go back to them. They trained alongside the 45th, and they had kind of the same training as we said, as a National Guard outfit with the multiple training, but they had questionable leadership now that plagued them throughout the war. So let's get into the battle here. They landed, the 36th, at the same place, and we were floating reserve as the United States military needed. And so they came in, and they were making pretty good progress up from off the beaches, but it was slow going. The Germans had kind of recognized this, and they held them up. They were able to hold up the 36th Division for quite a bit. There was, matter of fact, there was a bombing incident. Some of the United States dropped short and landed right in the middle of the 36th, and they were kind of a hard luck outfit. Things just kept happening to them over time. Down by the Sele River, and I'm probably saying that wrong. My Italian is not very good. And so that's where they were to move up and advance their way. Now, Operation Baytown was supposed to be where the British would come up the boot and we would join up. But you know how it is. You can make all the plans you want, and then they just go out the window as soon as you say go. And so they met stiff resistance later on as they made it on land. Again, Kesselring let them get on, and then we hold them up. So the 36th was there. They were having trouble, and Mark Clark realized that we need to send reserves in to help them, because about between the British and the 36th, there was a gap. There's about a 7-mile gap developed between them. Again, the Germans held up the British from coming on south. I'm talking about the original landing at Salerno, and the 36th was running into opposition as well. Slow going. They were making progress, but slow going. And this gap had developed between the 36th and the 10th Corps of the British outfit. And so Mark Clark realized about the same time the Germans did. And von Wittinghoff was the commander of the Germans. And Mark Clark decided we need to send in the floating reserve a little early. Now, the floating reserve, I go back to the shipping. Instead of the entire division, it was the 179th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Division, and all 3 battalions were intact. They were on board ship coming in, and the 157th, which was the Colorado National Guard. Now the 179th and 180th, you'll hear of the two regiments from Oklahoma, and the 157th was a regiment from Colorado. But they only had 2 battalions of the 157th as floating reserve. They didn't have enough shipping to get them all there at the same time. Go to my next screen. So, as it says, Thunderbird and Salerno closing the gap. They were landed north of the Sellery River, the 179th Infantry Regiment, all 3 battalions. They were told, they came on shore pretty quickly, and they went inland about 2 miles, kicked back. They didn't have a whole lot of action. Now, I go back to the gentleman I talked about, Mr. Emmett Steeds, First Sergeant of Charlie Company, 179th Infantry Regiment. His personal story about Salerno was the fact that they were coming on shore. And again, they were under the idea that, you know, what happened to the Italians? Why are the Germans here? And as they were coming up, they didn't see a lot of action, but out of nowhere, apparently tanks of the German Panzer Grenadier showed up on just off the beach, and they were firing on them. And all he could think of was, boy, if we get those guys, are going to tear us up on the beach. And so he liked looking off to the right and saw a British, I'm going to say a cruiser, but a small ship of the British Navy. And he said it suddenly started rolling over, and he was afraid it was sinking. And he realized what they were doing. They were filling their ballast tanks to tip over so they could bring their guns to bear on these tanks. And he said it was extremely impressive. They unloaded on him, and he said they knocked him off the beach. Matter of fact, after he came on the beach, he noticed that he looked into one of the tanks, and they had knocked the turret off of it and leaving only half of one of the tankers in it. He said it was very impressive, and he sure liked the British Navy for saving his bacon.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Ted, because we talked about that was the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, or Fallschirm Panzer Division last week with Lawrence Patterson, and this idea that as I said earlier, the Germans don't quite know how to defend. The Allies don't really know how they're going to attack. And, you know, again, if we compare this to Overlord a year later, the Allies have way more strength in depth. They have if this goes wrong, we'll use this. If this goes wrong, there's lots of contingency plans, lots of fail safes, lots of coverage and backup, and I suppose insurance. And to me, as I said, the Salerno landings have this sense of there's not much of a plan B on either side.
Yeah. It's just kind of again thrown together. It's like it's more of, instead of planning, we'll react to what they do. There's not a what do we do? It's just, oh, here it is, let's do this. And it was a situation like that. And these tanks coming up, they had kind of faced the 36 had faced the same thing, and apparently they had gotten behind and pulled the same trick, but it was amazing that they finally did make it after that. That was really the only opposition they met on the beach. And again, they came from behind the 36, way on the right flank, and they were taken out pretty quick. Because once they made the beach landing, of course, they were going through where the 36 had already been fighting. They had, going up to the assembly point, the 179th recognized the scars of battle. There were vehicles destroyed. They say, one of the guys said he noticed bandages all over the place they'd gone by, where apparently there was a field hospital, and that just the incredible battle that had taken place with the 36th. And so they stopped and rested and had some C rations, and ate and prepared. And they didn't last very long. I believe it was about 1,500 hours. They were told, "Get going, boys. We got to move up, because there's this gap that we have to close." And so they were pretty quickly hoofed it up to north. I believe they were expected to go about 7 miles inland to start closing the gap between the 34th and the 10th Corps of the British Army. And I go back to my friend Emmett Steeds, and this is one of his personal stories. After that, they were going up, and him being first sergeant in Charlie Company was the lead of the 179th. The 179th was the lead of the push, of a kind of a two-pronged push up near the Sellery River. And as he came up, I'll never forget him telling the story. They were coming kind of around a corner, and these Germans had dropped the netting on a tank. He didn't know what type of tank. He didn't know it was Mark IV, Mark III, or whatever it was. But they dropped this netting, and on either side of this tank were machine guns. And they opened up on them instantly. And he said the tank fired, and the round came so close to his head, he felt the heat go right by his head. Now, it takes a moment to react to that. And he said off to the side they went. They split, got off the road. And that was when he got hit in the leg. He was hit in the calf, his left calf, and they dispersed. The Germans were everywhere. And he found himself in this giant bush. And his story is so amazing, I just have to tell it. They got into this bush, and he said the Germans were all over the place and basically hunting down the guys that had broken off from the engagement. And he said they were shooting into all these bushes and around trees and things because they knew guys were in there. And so he was laying there, and this German came up, was coming closer to his hiding place, and he pulled his rifle up. And I asked him, I said, "What were you going to do?" He said, "Well, I would have killed him, but of course he had his friends around him. They would have dispatched him pretty quick as well." And he said, just as the guy was about to come over and pull the trigger, somebody in the background, like, "Hey, Fritz, come here," got his attention. So he turned away from where Emmett was hiding and went off on his own. Now, mind you, Emmett was hit in the leg, a pretty good wound, and he was laying there and was just, the adrenaline was going 90 miles an hour. And he was so exhausted, he laid his head down and he fell asleep as nightfall came. One of the funny things he said, he was disappointed that right in the air where he was at, the Germans brought a what they always call a goulash cannon to feed the troops, the German troops. And he said, "I was disappointed they didn't invite me for dinner." I think he's kind of glad to skip that. But he found himself dead tired. He fell asleep and woke up in the middle of the night, noticed his watch was glowing. "Oh, that's all I need for them to see my watch." And he simply turned it around and fell back asleep. Later on that next morning, that next day, he was still there, and they were firing a rolling barrage. And he thought, "Here we go. I've escaped the Germans, and here I'm going to get killed by a rolling barrage by our own artillery." And luckily he stated that one of the rounds that would have been right where he was went too far, and that saved his bacon. He jumped up out of the bush and took off back south to find his own people. And he was behind lines for 2 days and finally made it back to friendly lines. But his invasion of Salerno was over. He was so badly hurt that he ended up going to a hospital in London. And so that tells you, what this guy's laying there in severe pain. So that was a great story. And I always admired that man for what he could do. And it was very interesting. Now let's go back with the presentation. My apologies for getting
please continue with those stories. I was just going to make a point, Ted. It's that the debates about the merits of the Salerno landing, should they have focused somewhere else? Was Anzio worth it? Should they have even gone to Italy? Should they have done this? They are, as you say, they're ones for the historians, but nothing replaces just hearing about what the guys themselves were there felt like, because they don't decide where the landings are. They don't look at the operational structure of the German defenders. They just have to go and fight and take the next village, take the next hill, take the next. So I'm glad that that's your angle, because with the planning of the Italian game, everybody's got an opinion and there's no definitive answer. It's educated and kind of fun conversations, but the experiences of those who are there, they are the meat of it. So thanks for that.
No, excellent. I'm glad you appreciate that. And we'll get back to more of the facts of everything. And here we go with the Salerno. It was the second amphibious landing. Of course, we did Sicily, and then Salerno was number 2, landing near Agropoli and Paestum. The elements of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division and the 16th Panzer Corps, they faced them. Again, they moved up into the gap. And as I tell you the story about Emmett going up through, I'm reading this, after a week of heavy fighting, they then pushed northward toward the Calore River. Now, I may be ahead of myself here, but I am well ahead of myself. Things didn't change. I will tell you about some other incidents that I know that they knew about. The 179th, as I said, they were landed north of the Sele River. And so they had moved on up, and where Emmett had been hit was pretty close to a place called the Tobacco Factory. They just north of there. And so the 179th, all three regiments had pulled back to just about the tobacco factory. And they were in pretty deep trouble. They were being attacked hard and heavy by the 16th Panzer Division, and the 29th Panzer Grenadier was kind of on their right. Now, we'll kind of center most of the battle for the division and the regiments of 157th and 179th were really around the tobacco factory. And again, I go back where I said that it was a very flat area, just a big open plain. And one of the high points there, if you could call it a high point, it's more of a swell, was around the tobacco factory. It's right next to the Sele River. And so they were able to fall back to that. And, you know, he who keeps the high ground usually will win the battle. And so they fell back, the 179th, but they were in pretty deep trouble. They ended up being surrounded by those outfits, and they were trying to destroy them. The first night they were there, the artillery was pretty hard and heavy, and they really had nothing more than small arms, grenades, some bazookas, and things like that, and small artillery. Matter of fact, one of the accounts I read was about they had a 105 howitzer, but the aiming compass and it's not compass, but the sights were all torn off, and they couldn't use it, except they were bore sighting it. They were looking down this road. Whenever a tank would show up, they'd throw around in and fire, and that was the only really big artillery they had. Now, the division artillery was moving up as rapidly as they could, but they were rushing the 157th in to come up and help the 179th to relieve them, or at least give them some help. Problem was, when they were coming in from floating reserve, they were landed south of the Sele River. And so they were on the wrong side of the river, and they couldn't cross because all the bridges had been blown. They rushed as quickly as they could, the 120th Engineers, to put a bridge up. And they were running into some pretty heavy artillery and action by the Germans as well on that side of the river. So the 157th was trying to fight their way as far north as they could to get as close to the 179th to relieve them. Now, my apologies, I'm going to have the dates. I'm not going to give you a lot of dates or anything, but just the fighting that I know of and that these guys told me about. The division artillery commander was a gentleman named Ray McLean. He won the Silver Star there, which is unusual for a man who is a general. He was a brigadier general. And he was able to realize the situation. And so he gathered a group together of the 645th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and they pulled the division artillery as far up as they could. Down where the Calore and the Sele River were, they placed the division artillery. And they knew that they were going to have to use it pretty hard and heavy. He took a convoy personally up there, broke the lines, and was able to get resupply to the 179th, which, as I said, were surrounded at the tobacco factory. The left flank had been opened, and the 3rd Battalion finally went out there, and that was one of the things that later on saved them. Now, the 179th had a commander, Encorn, and he was actually a pretty smart guy. He was a historian for the most part, and he remembered a tactic that Alexander had used. I don't know where he used it, but he ran his battalion over a bridge that he knew was observed, and that was on the north side of the river. He ran them over that 3 times, making his outfit look much bigger than it was. And in the battle, only a historian of Alexander the Great would know that. And so that was one of the reasons, I believe, later on why it changed the course for the Germans. They had the 179th surrounded, and General McLean, though, I'm going to go back to that, pushed in and got resupplies to him and had the artillery open up. Now, the artillery for the division played a great role for us. It really saved the whole beach landing and closing that gap from the Germans. They kept counterattacking, going against the 179th there. And finally, the 157th was able to make their way up to, my apologies, I'm trying to go back to here, up to Persano, which was just east of the tobacco factory. And they were holding the position, and they had the 36 on their right flank. And the Germans constantly were hitting where they were at, where the 36th and the 45th met. So the battle raged for days, and finally, the division artillery fired, I believe it was 6,480 rounds. They had fired so many rounds. I had a gentleman tell me one time at one of the reunions, he was with the 160th Field Artillery, and he said the river was right there, and the guns were so hot because they just kept firing over and over again that they took buckets, and they were kind of doing bucket brigades and throwing water on the guns to cool them off. That was the volume of fire. Matter of fact, it had gotten so bad by I believe it was the 14th, the final day. Each battery was down to 5 rounds as all they had. They were having a hard time getting resupplies off the ship. That was one of the problems, but thankfully that was about the finale of the battle. Those guys really saved the beachhead. I'm going to also talk about the tobacco factory and the fact that it would play a role later on. They call it the factory at Anzio, and we can cover that at another time. But it was this structure, and it's, as I said, it's still there. They fought around there, and it was back and forth. The Germans literally at one time were on one side of it, and the Americans were on the other side, the 179th. It was an interesting battle. The last big show of the battle, I would say, was on the 157th side, and they had they knew this area that the tanks would be coming through, and there was a tanker with them. It said, commander who said, you need to put all of your anti-tank mines on the road. Don't place them anywhere else. You've got to keep these guys from coming down. It ended up being the last push of the Germans. And this man said, no. He said, the sergeant of the engineers said, no, you want to put it up on this knoll up above, because if you're in a tank, don't go down the road. They're going to have it mined. And so he mined this knoll. He had a big fight with this tank commander, but he said, no, we're going to put him up there. And I believe it was the night of the 14th, out of nowhere, the minefield erupted. The Germans had come through and did exactly what he expected. They lost 8 tanks there. And about the same time this started exploding, the division artillery opened up in the same area, which did an unbelievable job of just wiping out the men. They said afterwards, they went up there and there were German body parts and people and all the tanks. And they said they'd actually hauled off a lot of the men and a lot of the tanks. They had pulled them away, but there were 8 still sitting there smoking. That was really the turning point whenever the Germans realized we're not gonna win this. Von Widdinghoff had actually got a hold of Early and told Kesselring that we're going to take him, we're going to run him down the beach, and we're going to run him off into the ocean. There was a point, I will point this out, and I like this, that Mark Clark actually was thinking about pulling the division and the Americans off that beachhead. General Middleton, the general for the 45th Division, said, no, we're not going to do it. He said, put food and ammunition behind the 45th. We're staying here. And not only was it a heroic huzzas to his guys, you can do this. It was also a fact that he knew that if they did that, he was going to leave a lot of men there, going to lose a lot of men. He was very well thought of by the division men because he did care about his men a great deal. And they were very grateful for that. And, it does look pretty good when your commanding officer saying, we're going to forge right through. You're not pushing us off. And so I know I've kind of gone through it pretty quick, but that was kind of the last big bang of the German forces. They decided von Widdinghoff, for whatever reason, not realizing that the 179th was beaten down to 70% casualties. One of the men told me that if he'd have pushed any further, one more, and they would have gone through because they were so beaten down and they were so low on ammunition. For whatever reason, and you can look at the running the regiment over the bridge 3 times, or you can look at other aspects of the battle. For whatever reason, von Widdinghoff pulled back and decided that they needed to regroup and that they weren't going to be able to push him back into the ocean. And so that set us up for the march up the boot of Italy, which that battle. It's hard to explain just how fast and hard it went. When I started researching it a little closer, I didn't realize just how quick it was. I know we've discussed it here at the museum, how combat is hours and hours and hours and days of boredom, and then broken up by minutes of absolute chaos. And so I think this was just about a 4-day 5-day battle of chaos, and it was a battle of wills. You're not coming this way. You're not going to push us off. And the men of the 45th actually were able to prove that they could hold their own. Again, another showing of something else that they learned and how they were able to withstand it. Especially I believe the officer corps. You were talking about how a lot of the guys were replaced, and we still kept Bill Malden said we still had an Oklahoma feel. The officers were still, most of them were still Oklahoma guys. And of course, after this battle, we regrouped and replaced men who were killed and wounded. I kind of got ahead of myself here. We have Ernest Childers was the first Native American to win the Medal of Honor, or to be awarded the Medal of Honor. He was just north, actually, of all the action. He was more up further around. So we've kind of got this out of place. But Ernest, I got to meet him several times, and he was just a wonderful man. This is his citation. It talks about how he was stuck behind enemy lines, and he had broken a foot, his instep, and he managed to make his way back. You can read it for yourself. Him and his men were coming back, and he kept running into pillbox and positions and kept taking them out. My personal story with him, he was here for a photo shoot at the museum, and I like to point this out. And what about the actions? How did that go? And he's told me, he said, if you want to know the truth, it was myself and some other people. He said it was all an accident. He'd gotten behind enemy lines accidentally, had broke his foot. It was in the middle of the night. He'd fallen into a crater, broke his foot. He said, we were just trying to get back to our lines. And it was a nightmarish situation. He said he kept running into Germans, and so he had to shoot them. So he always maintained that it was just an accident. But he was one of the men of the 45th Division. And
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ted, because Medal of Honor we've said it on this channel a lot. Medal of Honor citations are, of course, your first port of call to understand the basics of the action. But they're usually written by the press corps for public consummation. They're written for various reasons. And when you dig below the surface, the reasons for them, sometimes it's like the soldier is very angry and he just gets angry at the enemy and picks up a machine gun and runs against the hill. Sometimes you say it's kind of a situation of just kind of chaos and confusion and bad luck. But there seems to often be like a secondary story that comes out, but only if you're in the presence of that person, or that person explains it to you. The citations are really useful, but they're never the full story, are they?
They're the high. I would call it the high point, the highlights of it. He, matter of fact, I didn't mention at that same meeting that we were having. He said the last group of Germans that he took, he just had his bayonet, and he threw rocks into this position they were at, and they seen what he had done, so they came with their hands up. I said, wow. I said, that's pretty exciting. And he said, oh, he said, you won't believe it. He said, I didn't tell him. He said, all I had was my bayonet. He had no ammunition left. He said, thank goodness that they didn't fight, and they were the last Germans he ran into. That's kind of the things you wouldn't read in the citation. And also when he received the award, it happened, I believe, in southern Italy, and there were a lot of Commonwealth troops there. And they brought all these guys out because it was a huge ceremony. And he said thought, God, look at all these guys. They were British, Polish, all of the nations, South Africa, all these different nations. He thought, oh my God, he said, they're going to shoot me. They're going to make an example out of me because I got out in the wrong position. He said, I really thought it's going to be terrible, until he saw the Medal of Honor. He realized, oh, okay, they're not going to shoot me. And he was just, it's not there for an execution, I think.
Punishment or medal, that's kind of a binary choice, isn't it? Yeah. Thinking you're going, I'm starting a day, am I going to get punished or rewarded? It's a very,
either end of the scale. He wasn't sure. And I like to finish this up. This is a personal story. The gentleman I told you about, Emmett Steeds, and I mentioned him in the previous program, Ben Cheek. He was the one that was one of the strongest guys in the Charlie Company 179th. He was a native Indian, Muskogee Creek. And Emmett Steeds, it was about his best friend. He was first sergeant. Ben was one of his other sergeants in command as well. Ben didn't make it out of Salerno. He died September 17th. And Emmett wanted to see his grave, and he never lived to see his grave. It was very hard time to find graves, and I was lucky enough about a year ago to find it on a website. His grave is in a small town in Oklahoma, and you can see we went and visited, and I put a Thunderbird flag on there and an American flag. This brings out, it's not just numbers, it's actual people. And Ben came back home to Oklahoma Territory from where he was from, Native American Indian. And I just wanted to show that it's not just numbers, they're people.
No, absolutely. And we'll have some questions for you. Before we do some questions,
sorry.
One of our viewers is saying the famous tobacco factory or cigarette factory, it was always a depot warehouse. It was never actually a factory, but in all the literature, it's been called a factory. And it's one of those little things that once a battle earns a name, there ain't no changing it. But for the detail freaks, there, it was never actually a factory. It was a depot.
That's good to know. I like you, at just tobacco factories, you just figured it was where they manufactured cigarettes and cigars or things. I had no idea. Good to know. Thank you for the information.
At the end of this, this 3 or 4 day battle, that it was the support from the 155mm long toms and the naval gunfire and Monty's 8th Army coming up that saved Salerno, because there were, as you said there, each of the units involved had these moments where it kind of could have gone either way. The Germans were kind of gaining, like Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. There were these high water marks the Germans had, and then they would lose them again. The Allies had these high water marks, and eventually a side prevails. And one of James Holland's points is that most sort of offensive operations have a shelf life of 3 or 4 days. It doesn't matter what you're doing, which side you are. After 3 or 4 days, everybody's just exhausted. You cannot, and it's kind of, the outcome is often as much last man standing as it is who was the one who had the kind of the tactical nous. It's just that after a certain point, last man. And at the end of this, you're saying how 70% casualties in one of the regiments and ammunition shortages, and yet they were kind of the last man standing. And the Germans clearly didn't know that at that point. They were obviously suffering as well. And the historian can look at it objectively now and say, well, actually, this unit could have been in a position to move on at this point there. But after 4 days of fight, everybody's just spent.
You're beat up. Yeah. And of course, as we call it here in the States, Monday morning quarterback or a side chair general, hindsight is 2020. You can say, well, why didn't they do this? And it's hard to explain to people the fog of combat. I've never been there, thankfully. And you talk to these guys again, we talked about it earlier, that G.I. Joe sitting in his foxhole, your war is right in front of you. There's a guy right out there. He's trying to kill you. And you're concerned about that. You don't worry about the planning in the back. You don't care what's going on, in Japan, theater of war. You don't care. Right there's where you're at. And it's hard to explain that, unless you've ever been through that. Another comment he had on there, and I was remiss in not mentioning the naval gunfire, what the Navy played. Of course, I talked about the British cruiser coming through and taking out the tanks, but that was another thing. And we have a very interesting uniform here in our museum, which we hope to put on display at some time. We had Navy forward observer spotters with the 45th. And we have a uniform here. It's not on display, but it's a Navy man. And he wears a 45th Division patch because he was attached to the division as one of the Navy forward observers. And they played a massive role. Here we have the Germans coming down the pike, getting ready to push. Not only was it and again, my apologies to anybody with the Navy, living with the U.S. Navy and the British Navy, how they saved the beachhead as well. When they called in a fire mission, it wasn't just the 45th the artillery. It was the Navy gunfire, and those were pretty big guns and pretty darned accurate. They played a large role. So I failed in pointing them out, but yeah, they played a big role. And that uniform that we have here just says it all. That guy was pretty darn proud and was able to wear an Army patch on his Navy coat. I love that story.
And it was forward observers that were one of the, I would say, the main learning points from this campaign that were taken for late, for Anzio, there are more forward observers, and in Overlord and Normandy, the doubling up of forward observers embedded with infantry, because by 44, artillery is a feature of the Allied armies that is a huge asset. It's a battle winner. And the longer the war goes on in the European theatre, the more and more artillery becomes a game changer. It's something the Axis are struggling to keep up with. So being able to bring to bear artillery is incredibly important. I'm sure the history explorer, our resident artillery serving officer, Rob Boom, is adding that bit about how important artillery was, both ground artillery and naval artillery. So we've got a little bit of time there. So any other kind of moving stories you have from in speaking to the guys in the division? Do they remember the Salerno campaign separately, or does Italy become kind of one big long kind of trudging campaign? Because that's the nature of it, is that some of these units were there for over a year. How do the guys in the 45th look back on it? Or did they?
I remember specifically, yes, they did. Again, Sicily was it was combat. It was their first combat, and but it wasn't really, heavy combat. They did run into some, as I said, the Italians had German minders holding guns to them to have them stay positioned, but it wasn't anything like Salerno would be. They remembered Salerno because it was unbelievably heavy combat. They hit a lot of roadblocks, and it was the first big combat, as in heavy, just trudging it out kind of combat. So they did remember it. Especially here in Oklahoma, the 179th Infantry Regiment. A lot of those members were here, and they helped start this museum. And so I got a lot of their stories, and they were there. They, matter of fact, I'll tell you kind of a quick story about how bad it was. I had the gentleman I talked about earlier, who his father had the garage in the earlier one, and they trained there. He was a mechanic, and I noticed he had a combat infantry badge, and how did you earn that combat infantry badge? Well, it got so bad there that it was, they had clerks, members of the band, cooks. Grab your rifles, boys. You're going up to the front. And Bill, as we called him here, Bull, he got called up and kind of like, I'm a mechanic. What am I supposed to do? Last time he had trained with the rifle was back in basic for the most part. And so he got to come up like it was a privilege. He had to go up, and basically to save the beachhead and fight in combat that he wasn't used to. And so we had a lot of stories like that. And that's why I think they remembered it so vividly, because it was just drop your stuff, guys, all hands on deck. You're going to have to go. Matter of fact, another interesting story that Bill told when they were getting off the ship, and I'll throw this out there. Hopefully people enjoy this because it's an amazing story. We never did really win the air war around there. The Germans were strafing, and they were bombing, and it was kind of a mess. And he was telling me when they were on the LST unloading, that suddenly out of nowhere the German Luftwaffe comes out, and they're strafing and they're bombing. I think they were bombing more than they were strafing. And he said one came through, and it was coming close to him, and below him there was a bulldozer, and they were pulling stuff out of storage or out of the water. And I can't remember what he was doing there, but he said as this bomb was coming, they all hit the deck. He was in the middle, and his friend on the left, and another friend on the right. And the bomb hit just to the I believe the starboard side, and exploded. And they were like, "Oh, geez, how lucky!" His buddy on the far left of him was hit in the behind by a piece of shrapnel from it. Somehow it just skimmed over the top of it and missed him. But the gentleman, they got up and kind of like, "Ooh, that was a close one." To look down, and the bulldozer was still moving, but the gentleman operating had no head. He had been decapitated. And he said that's when they realized, wow, we're in a pretty ugly situation. And I know that for Bull was one of the wake up calls, like, wow, this is not Sicily. This is a whole different cup of tea. So it was an interesting situation for them. And yeah, they did remember it greatly. It was imprinted on their memory really tight at the reunions.
Well, we've already been asked, are you going to come back and talk about the division later in Italy? And the answer is whether you want to. I'm happy to invite you back. And Anzio is the big one in many ways, the division, isn't it?
It really is. For the division, it was another turning point. a lot of it ended up being a lot like Salerno, but yeah, that was one that the guys talk about like crazy. And it's going to sound strange, but some of the fun things they did to bide the time, it was amazing because it was a very long drawn out period, but some of the things they did to entertain themselves and protect themselves were pretty interesting, I'll have to say. And if you'll have me back, I'd like to talk about
definitely.
that.
And my last question really is about, we talked about, I think before we went online ourselves, is that, I've got 2,000 books sitting out on my shelves there, and I've got a whole shelf about the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, but the 45th is underrepresented. We have the cartoon, the William Joe cartoons. We have Flint Whitlock's book, which I think is good without being excellent. We've got the history that came out just after war, which is good but not very, very thorough. There was Alex Kershaw's The Liberators book that had the TV show,
yes.
but I think a lot of people found that animation a bit of a struggle to get into. I liked it, but it didn't have the same magic as something like the Band of Brothers for me. So how do you feel as someone who's out there banging the drum on a sort of daily basis for the region, for the Oklahoma, for the 45th? Do you feel that they deserve a bigger spotlight?
Well, of course, obviously I would, knowing all the guys and hearing their exploits. Kind of a funny thing, there are memorials all over Europe, Italy, from a lot of the other divisions, especially regular Army outfits. And I knew the gentleman who ran the division association. And I asked him one time, how come we didn't have, I went to Dachau, which the division helped liberate at the end of the war. And how come we don't have it? Two other tank outfit and the 42nd Division, they have this beautiful plaque. How come we don't? And his name was Rex Wilson. Great stories about Rex down the street. And he said, "Well, we're not braggadocious. We don't need that recognition. We went and we did what we were supposed to do, and that's all we were asked to do, and that's what we did." I thought, gosh, it's a different attitude. And they didn't like wearing their medals. I think a lot of the American soldiers don't, but they really did not. And so they didn't care for the limelight. I'm here to say, you guys, you really need it. And their part of World War II history has kind of been set back. They were a National Guard division. They didn't have like the regular Army, a setup of newsmen to show, put them up. I think we were beside the 3rd Division in World War II the whole time. We won or were awarded 8 medals of honor, and I think the 3rd Division had over 20, almost 30 some of them. And it was one of those things. They didn't want it, and they just wanted to get back home. They just wanted to go home and be normal people. And so they didn't ask for that. And and I was so glad to see Flint Whitlock's book, and they were really held back on talking to him because they were worried that he was going to do a bad expose, because there were a lot of, especially in Sicily, some incidents that were questionable about POWs. And then at Dachau, there's always this question, and I was able to talk to several of those guys, and it's been blown out of proportion to some degree. And so they were really held back. And so now that actually, sadly, they're all gone, I know of only one 45th guy still left in Oklahoma, and he's 102 years old. Warren Lee Peters, a wonderful guy. I can't say enough about him, and luckily we're here to, like you said, beat that drum, and I'm glad to see them get the recognition they did, because they played key roles. Whitlock's book is called The Rock of Anzio. He said the third was called The Rock of the Marne. He said they should have been called The Rock of Anzio because, much like the Salerno, they held the beachhead, and it was another dogfight. So very proud of those guys. And I appreciate you letting me come on and talk about these guys.
The pleasure is all mine. And I don't want to put words into your mouth there, but I'm also assuming that for a lot of the men of the division, they came back to pretty hard and grim lives. I'm not saying poverty was universal, but Oklahoma's never, perhaps from my point of view as an Englishman, never had perhaps the money of other people. And I think about in Britain, for example, we had a whole plethora of books about people who've been in Colditz prison of war camp because they were upper class. They had money. They were able to sit and write their memoirs and get them published. But I'm assuming your average GI from Oklahoma went back to a pretty hard life.
Well, to be honest with you, no.
Okay.
the United States was pretty prosperous. Oklahoma, we set on a great deal of oil and wheat and very agricultural, and we tried to feed the world. Now, they came back also, and I think all of the American GIs came back to the GI Bill.
That's true.
And we have a lot of those men. I can tell you right now, before the war, they would have never seen college. A lot of them would have never left the state of Oklahoma, and let alone see the world. So when they came back, they were very fortunate that we were building the world back, and it was a great economy for us afterwards. And so here in Oklahoma, the GI Bill helped a lot. I know a lot of the men went into teaching. Education was a big thing for them. Oil and gas had been developed pretty hard and heavy. And later on in 1948, the division was brought back. They were taken down December 7th of 1945, but they brought it back in 1948. And those guys went right back in. That's how we got into Korea. But they made a career of being National Guardsmen here in Oklahoma, taking care of their own. So you would have thought, but no, it was a very prosperous time in Oklahoma.
I'd forgotten about the GI Bill. As a Brit,
Yeah.
because we didn't have anything like that, I do tend to forget that, because so many of my family came back to unemployment and shitty times. I forget that the GI Bill was probably for me as an Englishman, the single biggest thing that was the boon for the USA was the GI Bill. You look at the number of people who founded businesses that wouldn't have otherwise had an opportunity. I always tend to forget that. But before we bring things down, and people are saying keep on talking because they're enjoying this, but anything else that you think, the wider world should know about the 45th that perhaps they don't know?
Oh gosh, the 45th. I'll go as quick as I can. They were a federally recognized division up until 1968, and they were taken down. And they didn't play any role except for the Air National Guard in Vietnam. They had some missions over there. I just kind of want to put out the fact that they were local guys. They were. I'm going to say, of course, they weren't all, but we had so many that were just salt of the earth. I was very fortunate to get to know so many of them and some of the leadership. It's one of those things that it's hard to put into words unless you got to meet a lot of those men. They did come back to Oklahoma, I would say this, and they became leaders of this city and this state. We're very fortunate about it. I also want to say that to today's Oklahoma National Guard, we continue that lineage. They've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. They trained the Afghan army. At this time, I think I told you they were in the Horn of Africa doing duty. They were in Bosnia. They still play a role in our country. The men and women of the Oklahoma National Guard and I've got to say, I'm very fortunate to be with these people. I've admired them, and I tried to join the Guard. They said I was a little pudgy, so I couldn't pass it. Hey, it happens.
Well, the Guard's loss is the museum's gain. That's how I'm going to end this. Is that
thank you very much.
We're glad we have these ambassadors. There's been various guests on my channel. Ronald Yelters over in the Netherlands who's written about the 8th Battalion Rifle Brigade in World War II. There's these other people that spring to mind who have been squirreling away, and sometimes for decades, about whichever unit it was that got under their skin, and they've been writing about. And yes, we have national museums. Yes, we have big name writers talking about big campaigns. But without people like yourself, Ted, we wouldn't have these stories. So you're thanking the men of the division for coming back to Oklahoma and making Oklahoma great. But I'm thanking you and your staff there and people who work at the museum there for getting that story out there and keeping it alive, because it's been on Twitter this week. I had struggled getting in contact with some various museums in the UK. They're underfunded. Military museums, regimental museums they don't have the people behind them, and it would be a shame to let these histories go, because as you've made it clear, it's not just about their service for their country in times of war. You talked about the fact that as a guard unit, they were helping out in hurricanes and tornadoes and what have you, and disasters, and the fact that they are also part of the building of the state in times of peace. And I think that's important to get across as well.
As we like to say, they're your neighbors, they're your friends, they're in the supermarket with you. When they're called, they're the first ones to stay. They go towards danger. They don't walk away from
towards
it.
adversity
They stand
is
up
the
to it.
expression I like.
And I will say we're in the process of building a new museum just down the street, double the size of this museum. And we've been very fortunate. Our Adjutant General, General Mancino, has been great helping us. And our director here, Dr. Denise Neal, I can't thank her enough. She's been great, and I'm very proud to be here. And of course, I wanted to, as you got to see, my assistant, Kendra Bosick. She is just fantastic. She helped put this program together, so I'd like to thank her as well.
Yeah, thank you,
and thank you for having me, Paul. I appreciate it.
Well, no, thank you for responding to the email I sent to the museum, because it's always important for us to bring in people with different perspectives. And in your case, this unique, very local, very loyal, very passionate perspective, because I could just find some guy at a war college to research the 45th Division and put together a package for the channel, and it would be great. But you're bringing this personal affection, which is frankly is priceless. So, folks, if you haven't seen it already, the description for the show includes a link to the 45th Division's Facebook page and what have you. You can find out more online, and I suggest you do it. And next time you're in Oklahoma, I would go and do it. And we've got one last question for you.
Oh, okay.
So Sheldrake has asked, what did Ted think of the Liberated, the animated Netflix film? So I found it struggled to get into. What was your opinion? Bearing in mind, Alex Kershaw is a friend of the show, so be careful what you say.
Oh, well, Alex is a great guy. I love him to death. He's a good guy. The book was very good. I will have to say that. But I'm like you. It was bothersome trying to watch. I watched part of the first episode. I was like, yeah, that's it. I can't. I couldn't handle it. I was hoping it would be more Band of Brothers, and we got more something like Woody Woodpecker. It just.
Yeah, I took
didn't work for me. I don't know.
episodes to get into it, and even at the end of it, I appreciated the history. I appreciated that it was giving a spotlight on Alex's brilliant book, but it just. Yeah, it was a miss for me, really.
It was a miss for me as well.
It's the difficult second album in kind of band terms. But anyway, I feel like I've met another friend here. So James is saying Ted is so valuable to me. He's saying so. He's always going to watch this show again a second time. He liked it so much.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I'll invite you back, Franzio. And I'm also going to be doing a series of shows spotlighting museums where we have people just coming on just for 15 minutes talking about what their museum does. So maybe that's something for some of you or for Kendra, so I'll get in touch about that. But anyway, folks, we'll bring things to an end. I am back again tomorrow with Matthew Graham, who had to postpone the show because he was unwell, but he's better now. That's First Armor, and that'll be much more about doctrine and tactics and tank strategy. And then on Sunday, we're off to one of the atolls in the Pacific with Ryan Lowry, and then there's lots more. I think there's 2 shows on Monday. There's Frank McDonough's coming on about the Weimar Republic, and there's so many things coming your way. So as always, folks, thanks for those who become patrons. Thanks for supporting us via the channel. Thanks for buying the books. Thanks for going and visiting the websites. But folks, I'm going to say goodbye now. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, Ted. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying see you again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.